So hello everybody, thanks for sticking around. We got one more of the post presentation. So Ms. Roe, would you like to take it away?
Yes. So Ms. Roe is my mentor. My
sorry.
name is no. It's
The wrong thing.
I was going to start off that way. I didn't mean for it to sound
Thank
that way. But so Ms. Roe is my mentor. My name is Hannah Cornett. I'm a secondary education student at JSU. I'm in my last semester. I'm currently doing my internship, so I'm getting to spend a lot of time with a bunch of high school kids, and might be wearing off on me a little bit. My mom said, I've never heard that word before, and I was like, I've never used that word before. So their vocabulary is wearing off on me too. But so every senior practicum, usually the semester before last, we do a study on our students' learning and the development that they endure during a learning segment. And I chose to do mine on Elegiac writing. So a lot of times when we do research and data development in the classroom, it looks a little bit different than a lot of data developed on a wider scale. So when we use our data, sometimes it can be subjective when we're looking at the way our students met the standards we laid out for them, especially when we plan a learning segment. Students have a variety of different learning styles. They learn in so many different ways, and we have to adjust our teaching to meet their needs. So, and I'm sure all of you know that. You have students that you spend time with all the time. But so I decided to develop my learning segment on Elegiac writing. So my students were going to endure a pre-assessment and a post-assessment. And as I had a few formative assessments in between that kind of scaffolded their learning. But when I began, we had a 4-line elegy that my students were going to kind of practice. So I paired them up and I set out the standards for them. So I have a few graphs here that I'll discuss as I go on, but I set out a few standards for them. One was rhyme scheme, tone, and grammar mechanics. So these were some things that I wanted my students to be able to do. And I knew beforehand they needed a little bit of an introduction into what an elegy was. So I started out with showing them W.H. Auden's Funeral Blues. It was read by Tom Hiddleston. They know who that is. They loved that. And we compared it to what a eulogy looks like. I played The Office's The Bird Funeral. So they were able to kind of compare some of those differences there, and they enjoyed that. But so we introduced to them some of the vocabulary that they would need to actually perform the pre-assessment the way they would need to. And some of those standards were tone, rhyme scheme, and grammar and mechanics. So my data charts are a little simple, but it's because my students, it was almost a yes or no kind of thing when I'm looking at it. They either met the standard or they didn't. So this is why it kind of looks like this. It's a 0 and a 1. They either met it or they didn't. So I have the whole class, and I compared my 3 focus students. I chose 3 students. I have a lower level student who has an IEP for reading, and he shows a lack of engagement. He really doesn't have a lot of motivation in the classroom, so I knew that would be a challenge going in. I have a student 2 who also has an IEP for reading, but he shows a really huge willingness to learn. So if I pair him with someone who's a little bit higher motivated, he excels in that area. And then I have my student 3 who takes every opportunity available to exceed the expectations. So I knew that kind of working these students into my data charts and my examination would, I think, kind of show me how well I did in teaching them at all. So the purpose of my data is to assess my own teaching, not just their learning, but to assess my instruction, really. So I was going to use this, and I think that's what gives educational data value, is we as teachers use this to assess how well we taught it to our students and what we can do in the future, or to help them kind of go back and fix that. So we can kind of change their learning or help them develop that further. So my student 1, he did, right here, student 1, he did not meet rhyme scheme before or after. He did meet tone before and after, and he did not meet grammar and mechanics before or after. So he's kind of my outlier here, because my other students, every other student, as well as my whole class, had progress. So I had a difference here of 8 students who did meet rhyme scheme to 10. So I had progress here. I had progress with my tone from 7 to 13, progress from 7 to 12 with grammar and mechanics, and my students 2 and 3, so this is my student who has an IEP for reading, but who does show a willingness to learn, and this is my student 3 who did not meet tone, but does have an ability to exceed the expectations every time. So this is my student 1 here that I focused a lot on, because he really has a low motivation. He doesn't do well in the classroom. He's really a hands-on learner. That's hard to do when you're reading literature. You can see his eyes rolling back in his head when you're reading to him. So that was my difficulty. So when I did my reflection, which is here, I kind of learned that a few of the things that I could do differently in the classroom is to approach this in a more hands-on way. So that's so hard to do. So we did a walk and learn. So not with the same type of activity, but in some of my other activities as I moved on in the future, we did some more rotating, some stations where they're moving around the classroom. He's working with peers who encourage him to complete his assignments and to stay on task, which is difficult to find, but we have a few students who, especially like my student 3, who does like to achieve and overachieve most of the time. So we tried to pair him with kids who would encourage him in the right way. We did a literary walk and talk. So we would walk down the hallway, we would pause, and we would discuss, and then we would walk a little bit further and they would talk with each other. So just things like that made a huge difference in his ability to excel in future curriculums and future activities. So here, he didn't excel at all. So that's why I had to reflect a little bit to look on what could I do differently to help him stay motivated in the classroom, especially since I think part of my difficulty is I'm in a very rural school. So I have a lot of students who want to work in more of trade careers. They're wanting to skip the college pathway and go straight into some of those things. So they struggle to find the value in the classroom. So I'm trying to fight that barrier to explain to them that it's just as important and valuable for them to learn as it is for a student who's studying to go to college, wants to do things you have to have a specific bachelor's degree for. That's the difficulty, is trying to kind of close that gap there and explain to them that the value is just as important for them. So that was kind of what I gathered too. I learned a lot from doing this. I had a lot of student work that I analyzed, and as I did that, I think part of my feedback from my student 1, who was really ended up being my entire focus, because these 2 students excelled, and I kind of had an idea before I did my research that they might anyway, because even though maybe he struggles, he shows an incredible willingness to learn in a way that I've never seen a student have the willingness to learn. So he would approach me after class, what can I do differently? How can I improve this? That's rare. And then this student who excels at everything, he picks up on things so quick. And so he ended up being, my student 1 was my focus the entire time. How can I push him to excel? He wants to be a welder. What can I do to connect him? Elegies and welding do not go together. So that was my struggle. But so mobility, being active in the classroom. So a lot of this data was used for my personal reflection. How can I improve this in the future? And I find myself, whether on a scale as large as this or on just a small scale, assessing them more and more as I teach now. This activity was incredibly beneficial to my teaching career now, because I look at some of my assignments and I'm like, so this didn't work for them, how can I fix this now? How can I look at their progress from my pre-assessment to my post-assessment? What can I do to meet the diversity of learning, the diversity of learning styles that they have? So some are visual, some are audio, some are mobility, they gotta move around. So I think it was incredibly insightful to me. It was incredibly insightful to my students. I was able to modify some things to help their learning along the way. So even though these graphs are a little bit simple, it kind of showed me that before they didn't, or they did meet the standard, and afterward they did or they didn't. And what can I do differently with that information? So I thought it was valuable to share, because it does look a little bit different, the data that we learn in the classroom versus data on a large scale. And data that we collect for students is so important, because data has value when you use it to improve something. And when you use it to improve students' learning, it's all that much more beneficial. So, thank you. Oh, does anybody have
Other
any
questions
questions?
first?
Sorry, got a little ahead of myself there. I do have some of my student work samples, but with some of my feedback.
I'll ask, were the 2 bottom graphs, were those 2 paired together or not?
So, yes, sir. So this is my student and he's actually incredibly kind, which is hard to factor into my data. But when you pair him with a student who has a willingness to learn, that's part of why he excelled, is he had somebody motivating him along the way. So any self-reflection that they did, I had somebody kind of guiding him through that. Any pair work they did, he always had somebody there saying, what can I do to help you? Or this is what we're doing. So yes, they were paired together. Looking back, I would have paired him with somebody. So.
I feel like the same skill set that makes you good at this makes you a good manager too.
Exactly.
Yes.
What is the difference between an elegy and a eulogy?
So in elegy, they're very similar. An elegy is pretty much just the song, poetic version of a eulogy. So that was what was fun, is most of them were familiar with the eulogy. So I got to show them W.H. Auden's. It's almost a sing-song tone to it. So when they're listening, it's like you listen to these songs a lot of times that are sorrowful and mournful, and that's what they are. They just don't recognize them as an elegy. We had also just, I failed to mention this, but they had just read The Crucible. So this was fun for them because we had a funeral for John Proctor. So I brought all of my Halloween decorations, and I gave them bonus points for dressing up in funeral attire. And So they had a connection that kind of motivated them to do well in this activity, so.
I'm gonna take your class.
Come to Gaston High School.
So you need to get your welder to build a coffin.
I need to,
Oh,
yes.
yeah.
No, he does well. We're just trying to work through those barriers there.
Any last question for our speaker? Last thing,